Okay, this time we are going to measure piston ring end gap. And to do that, we are going to need your piston with its rings. You're going to need your cylinder block, which I have on a block over here. We'll bring that into view later. You're going to need a set of steel feeler gauge blades. And you are going to need a piston ring expander. First thing that we have to do in order to measure ring end gap is to get the rings off of the piston. And what we're concerned with is the little gap between the rings, or in the ring right here. Problem is, when the ring is on the piston and the piston's in the cylinder, I can't measure the gap. And that's where I'm concerned with the gap is I want to know what the gap is while it's installed in the cylinder. So in order to do that, I have to take the ring off the piston and put it in the cylinder, and then I'm going to use my feeler gauge blades to find out how big that gap is. First thing we need to do is to get the rings off. And so I need to find the gap of the ring I'm going to be taking off, which in this case is this top compression ring here. And I'm going to put my index finger of my left hand opposite of the ring end gap. So that way when I push on the ring, it doesn't slip back into the groove like that. So I'm going to keep it pushed out like that. On my piston ring expander, these two little tabs on the inner middle part here are going to engage the ends of the ring within the gap. So we'll put this on here like so. I'm going to line that up with those two little edges or fingers in the gap. And then I'm slowly going to squeeze the handles and bring the sides around, which are going to support the ring, while the end gets expanded just large enough to slide it up and off the piston. While I'm holding it, I'm going to carefully come back and I'm going to use my left hand to hold the ring, and I'm going to gently let it go. Okay, so this is my top compression ring. Now if we take a look at this, see if we can get it to focus for us, some letters etched into the top of the ring. And you'll note that this top ring has like a chrome plating, so it's silver in color. We need to keep track of the piston rings in the order in which they come off the piston, because they're not all the same. I'm going to go ahead and set mine up in order on my cylinder block sand so that I know how to put them back on. You are likely going to want to tape it to your cardboard, because it will take us probably more than one lab period to get through it. So next up, we're going to go to this second compression ring and or scraper ring here. You'll notice that this one is a black in color, but it too has a letter laser etched into the top of it. So there's the right side up and the right side down. So once again, I'm going to put my finger for my left hand opposite of the ring end gap to make sure that the ring doesn't push into the groove. I'm going to take my piston ring expanding tool, engage that into the gap, and bring these sides around slowly and get it to expand just large enough to slide the ring up and over the top of the piston. I'll come back and I'll hold that. I don't want to allow these to drop on the floor because they're cast iron, and so they have a tendency to be brittle. And sometimes even the drop from the distance of a workbench is enough, if they land just the right way, to cause them to break. So we don't want that, which is why we use the special pliers instead of just trying to peel them off by fingers. This is our second compression ring here, and if you look very carefully and closely, you can actually see that there's two colors. It's like a darker blackish color on top and then a silverish color near the bottom, because it's likely made up of two different materials. And so therefore there is a right side up and a right side down with this one as well. So we'll put that one there. Now the last ring on the piston here is the oil control ring. This one is the one that controls the volume of oil that's left on the cylinder walls. This ring is actually three different rings, together in one groove. And it has an upper and a lower wiper rail, and then there's a middle expander spacer. For our measurement lab, you don't necessarily have to remove this one, but I'm going to go ahead and remove mine just to show you how they come off and go back on, and so you can see the different pieces. So the first thing I need to do is find the gap for the upper wiper rail, which is right here. And then I need to use my finger to push it out. And then this one is a steel wiper rail, so there's a lot more flexibility here. But I still want to be pretty careful that I don't cause the end of the rail to scratch the ring lands or the edge of the piston at all. And I can just very carefully unwind that. And that's my upper wiper rail. So I'm going to put that one right there. I'm putting it upside down so I can flip it back over. And then now we need to find the ends of the expander spacer, which are right here. This too is steel, so there's a little bit more flexibility to it. Only to an limited extent though, so we still have to be careful. And they can be kind of hard to get hold of, especially with gloves on. I lost my end. Okay, well, I got a hold of the lower wiper rail, so I guess we'll do that one next. Gently unwind that one. Okay, so there's the lower wiper rail. Put that one there. And here's the end for the expander spacer. We'll take that one off. Okay. So this is the expander spacer, and this is meant to keep the upper and lower wiper rail separate and spaced out from each other, but also allow oil to pass through it, because oil is going to pass through the oil control ring and into the holes behind the oil control ring, and then flow into the interior side of the piston here, where it will lubricate the wrist pin and then drain down back to the crankcase. So we'll go ahead and we'll put these off to the side while we measure our ring end gaps, and then I'll show you how we put them all back together. So with the piston rings off of the piston, I now need my cylinder block, and I need to go ahead and take one of my rings and put it into the cylinder. In order to do that, I'm going to want to start with one end and put it into the cylinder like this, and then I'm going to very slowly come over here and push the ring and kind of work it around, slowly compressing the ring till it fits in the cylinder. Once it's in the cylinder, you can see my gap here is rather small, but before I can measure that, I need to make sure it's square or perpendicular with the bore center line, and I need to make sure it's straight and even and everything is lined up. So I'm going to use my piston as a plunger, and I'm going to push it down about halfway until it's square and even like that. So you can see my gap right there. Let me get some better light here. So there's my gap, and this is where I now take my feeler gauge blades. And let's see, I will start with the 7/1000. So I'm going to take the 7/1000 feeler gauge blade, and I'm going to very carefully slide it down into the gap, trying to be very straight and gentle with it. Make sure that it's actually in the gap against the cylinder wall. If it moves the ring end gap, like pushes it down, that's a sign that either you're not going in straight or your feeler gauge blade is too big. But it should go in with just a little bit of resistance. This one I can kind of feel it wiggle around, and it slides in and out very easily. The 7 is too small, so now I'm just going to go up to the next size, and I'll try the 8 next. So now this 8 doesn't really want to fit. It's pretty snug in there. So I will go ahead and I will record this as an 8/1000 gap. Okay? And so we'll write that down on our sheet. Now, again, these rings are brittle and they can break fairly easily, so we have to handle them carefully. You have a couple options with getting them out of the cylinder without breaking them. You can't just reach in with one finger, hook it, and rip it out of there. If you do that, it's going to bind and twist inside the bore and it'll probably break. You either need to go in with 2 hands and slowly bring it up evenly until it comes out. Okay, or you can take your piston and you can push it all the way down gently and pop it out the bottom so that you have it in one piece. And then you're going to want to tape it back to your cardboard with your notes on which way is right side up and what order it came in. And then we would repeat the procedure for the next one here. Put one end in first, slowly work the other one around. Trying very carefully not to scratch up the bore with the ends of the ring, okay, or overly twist the ring. And then I have to use my piston to push down on it, straighten it out. Then I get my feeler gauge blades out again, and I'll start with the 7 once again. Okay, the 7 goes in and out pretty easy. So we'll go up to the next one, which is an 8. That one still moves pretty easy, so I'll go up to the next one, which is the 9/1000. A little bit of tension on that one, but we'll go one more we'll try the 10 next. If you have a gap that's excessively large, you might find that you need to actually stack a few feeler gauges. But usually if you are stacking feeler gauges, those rings are worn and are going to need to be replaced. So the 10 doesn't even fit. So we're going to go ahead and record this one as a 9. The whole point of measuring piston ring end gap is because it's a direct indicator of piston ring wear. And oftentimes we may not be able to just look at a ring and tell whether or not it's worn. And so we rely on measuring the ring end gap to tell us whether it is. Additionally, we also want to make sure that there's enough room for thermal expansion that when these rings get hot, like the rest of our internal engine parts, that there's enough room for them to fully expand without butting into each other. So then I'm going to carefully just pull up, carefully and evenly pull up on this so it comes out. Here's another view of the piston ring end gap. I raised it up a little bit so it'd be easier to see, and got you guys off to the side here a little bit so you can see the gap. And you can see my feeler gauge just went right down into it here. And I'm just holding this here and I'm going straight up and down with it, trying to gauge the tension of the ring end gap on the feeler gauge blade as it goes up and down in the gap. Okay, notice how the gap is still lined up. The two ends still meet up with each other after I remove my blade. Okay, I'm going to purposely go ahead and put too large of a blade in there so you can see what can happen and what you got to kind of watch out for. So this is a 12, which is going to be way too big. But if I go ahead and I put that in here, see how it slid down a little bit on me? I was able to get it to fit, but now the ends no longer match up because I wasn't careful with my feeler gauge blades. So we need to make sure that the ends still line up when they're done, and be careful we don't jam too large of a one down there. So really gentle, but hopefully you get to see from this angle a little bit better at how we're going to do this. Okay, so it's going right in between the two ends, up against the cylinder wall. So like I said, we're not going to do the oil control ring. Let's go ahead and put the rings back on the pistons. Move that up out of the way. Alright, so with reassembling the rings onto the piston, we want to start at the bottom and work our way up. So we're going to start with the oil control ring, and I'm going to start with the expander spacer first. So we need to get one side started here and slowly bring it out and around. And then when we put this on, we need to make sure that the two ends butt together and don't overlap each other. So right now, they are butted together. Let me see if I can get you a shot of that. The ends are right there. Oh, come on, focus. Okay, so the ends are right here. They're butted up to each other. That's the way they need to be. If they're overlapping, then we need to stop and fix that before we put on the wiper rails. Okay? And by overlapping, I'm going to use my hands here, is they're supposed to butt like this. If they go like this and overlap each other within the groove, then both of your scraper rails aren't going to fit in the groove also. It'll go on the piston, but now the ring won't compress into the groove, and what you'll find is that you have a really hard time reinstalling the piston back into the cylinder. So we need to make sure that we get those ends butted up right the first time. And then I want to stagger my end gaps, so I'm going to move this lower wiper rail. I'm going to start my wiper rail here, and I'm going to slowly work it around to the bottom. And you can see here my end actually for the expander spacer just popped out. I'm going to leave that for a minute, and I'm going to install the upper wiper rail, staggering my end gaps, and then I'm going to come back and fix it. So I'm going to very carefully get that started. Bring that around. Oops. Make sure that pops into the groove there. And then now we need to find the ends of the expander spacer, which right there you can kind of see it sticking out. And we need a small little device like a tip of a pen. Try to pull it out and pop back in. There it goes. See how it popped back in, and now they're butted up against each other once again. Right there. That's how they need to be. The two ends of the expander spacer right there, how they're buttoned up against each other. That's the way they need to be when the piston's ready to go back in. Sometimes they need a little bit of convincing. But if we don't do that, we will have a heck of a time getting it installed, because usually this ring will then stick out and won't compress, and then when we go to put it in, it just grabs that bottom of the rail and it totally distorts and wrecks the whole scraper rail on the bottom. Alright, so with that one installed, we'll move on to the next compression ring, the middle ring here. We need to make sure that the letter is going to face up, and it's going to be the one that's got the black oxide finish on top, and then the steel color on the bottom. So I'm going to hold it like this. I'm going to come in with my piston ring expanding tool. I'm going to put that right over the middle part. We'll slowly squeeze and bring the sides around until the ends engage with the ring end gap. And I can expand it. And then I'm going to open it up just enough to slide over the top of the piston. And then I'm going to use my finger here on the back side to help guide it and hold it into its groove while I slowly release on this side. And then make sure that it's in its groove and can rotate and spin freely, slide around. So that's the middle one. And here we go with our top one. The letters facing up. This one has an all chrome edge to it. Come in. Make sure it engages. Slide it over. Use my finger to make sure that it engages in the groove before I let go of it. Okay. Make sure it spins freely. Now before I consider the piston ready to reinstall, I'm going to need to stagger my ring end gaps once again. I don't want the ring end gaps lined up with each other, so I want to make sure that they're usually on opposite sides of the piston to start with. We will go over this in a little bit more detail during the reassembly phase, but just to make sure you get them all back on and right so you don't have to worry about them too much once we get to the reassembly phase. We do want to have them staggered, not lined up with each other, and they should all float and spin freely. And that's measuring ring end gap. Thanks for watching.